Happy Monday, Liberty Kitty Cats, and welcome back once again to the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast. Before we get into today's interview, I want to make sure you know about a special promotion we are doing for just a couple more days through the end of April. Anybody who joins the Lions of Liberty Pride are supporters on Patreon. Anybody who joins at the 15 or higher per month level will receive a free Tigers of Liberty t-shirt. This is our brand spanking new t-shirt. It is a parody of the Tiger King documentary. Of course, Bryan recently interviewed Josh Dial, Joe Exotic's Libertarian Party campaign manager on Electric Liberty Land. Be sure to check that out. But we now have an incredible, hilarious parody Tigers of Liberty t-shirt. You want to check it out over at lionsofliberty.store. And if you join at 15 or higher, that's going to more than pay for the t-shirt itself. We're going to send you one for free. Of course, at that level, you also get a free Lions of Liberty Taxation is Death mug, and you also get access to all our bonus audio, video content, live streams, and you get access to Howie Snowden's daily news links, which are just incredible. Once you see how this guy curates news, it's really an incredible thing to see. But you'll get those delivered right to your inbox as well. And don't forget, 10% of all of our Patreon earnings are going to help DonorSee with their battle, helping people all around the world, especially the third world, who are affected by everything going on with coronavirus. So join on up, get a free t-shirt, and help a great cause at the same time. Check it all out at patreon.com/Lions of Liberty.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here's your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Claire.
My guest today is a professor of economics at George Mason University and the author of 4 books, including his latest, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Bryan Caplan. Bryan, are you ready to roar?
Roar!
All right. Now, Bryan, I really want to get into this issue. This is an issue I've really become passionate about over the years, this issue of immigration and borders. But first, I want to get to know a little bit more about you. So I'm kind of curious, how did you first take interest in free market economics, libertarian ideas, everything that you write so passionately about?
It started with Atlas Shrugged in 11th grade, actually. So when I was in 11th grade, my best friend gave me a copy of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and had me read Francisco D'Anconio's Speech on Money. And I kind of like that.
It's a long one.
Yeah, but that's one of the short ones, actually.
Yeah, I guess it's all relative in that book.
But then actually the few days of the summer right before 12th grade, I actually did read it, and I read it in about 3 days in a stereotypical teenage, obsessive, sleep-deprived state. And after I read it, it seemed very interesting and inspiring, but then there's a question of, is this at all realistic? Can this be done anywhere in the modern world? And so that's when I started studying economics to find out whether what she was saying was completely crazy or not. And I'll say that the more I read, the more I said, well, I guess she's not completely crazy, actually. There's a lot of good points here. There's a lot of arguments that I never heard that seem very solid. So initially, I spent a lot of time reading Austrian economics and other free market economists, libertarian economists, so getting what you could say was a very biased perspective. But when I became a student at UC Berkeley, then I learned mainstream economics and saw a lot of value in that too and tried to reconcile those. And then I would say that in grad school, but especially once I became a professor, I got much more interested in psychology and sociology, but especially the psychology, and realizing it's actually hard to understand much about social science unless you also know a lot about the human mind and the way that human beings think and feel. And if you look at my books, I would say all of them have a very heavy infusion of not just free market economics and mainstream economics, but also psychology and really just interdisciplinary social science. And that's really where I end up coming from now.
Well, that's really interesting. It seems it was the philosophy and sort of the creative approach taken by Ayn Rand that led you to have interest in the ideas, and that led you to really just focus on, okay, now can this thing that I think seems so cool, so interesting, so fascinating, can this actually work in real life? So that led you directly to this sort of economic side. I'm curious, did your own experience lead to, the reasoning behind doing this book? This book is sort of a graphic novel. It's in graphic novel form. Are you trying to approach it in the similar way where you hope to sort of capture the imaginations of people, but then at the same time, as you do in the book, sort of break down the economic reasoning behind it?
Yeah, so you could definitely say that. I mean, I'd say in all my books, I'm trying to actually get people to read the book.
Right.
So
that's always step one.
Yeah. What I'll say is for a professor, I do a good job of that, but professors are terrible at getting people to read their work. So you could be fantastic professor and still be pretty mediocre. Right. For this last book, since it is a nonfiction graphic novel, I was trying to do something different, do something to, first of all, just convey a lot more information in a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. So I had seen other similar books, such as the Cartoon History of the Universe series, and said, wow, this is a great way to just give a much more intense dose of information per minute. And at the same time, to make it much more fun so that people actually keep reading. So basically, you multiply a lot more information per minute times a lot more minutes of people's time because they're enjoying themselves. So I would say that, like Ayn Rand, I am trying to really engage readers and inspire people. Although, very different from her is I'm trying to really incorporate research very heavily into the book. And in particular, unlike her, I don't just give you a bunch of references to books that already agree with her, which, right. She has great reading lists, but all the books that she cites basically agree with her. And that's not the way that you figure out how the world works, is by reading a bunch of things that tell you what you want to hear. So, when I write books, I make a very stoic effort to just read a very wide variety of views on this and find out, what does anyone of any note have to say about this topic? And yes, of course, I normally end up thinking that my approach is the better approach, but at the same time, this lets me just do a much better job. And also, I'll say, anytime I've worked on a book, I've learned some uncomfortable facts that are just hard to reconcile with my overall view. And then I'll say, okay, well, I guess I have to change the view then. What I said wasn't really true, and I've got to at least modify it somewhat in order to be honest.
I think that's such an important quality that I think whether it's libertarians or people of any philosophical bent should sort of take that approach to things. You always have to be open to challenging your views. We all got to our views from a certain direction, so at some point we were open to changing them from what they were, and we need to always be open to challenging ourselves, because either we're going to find out, oh yeah, this thing I believed was right, or we might find out, okay, maybe I was wrong at this issue, maybe I was looking at things in a different way. And borders, the issues of borders and immigration is one area where there's a lot of division among libertarians, and I think regardless of the views people come out with, I think everybody could do really well to look at the, sort of steelman the views of each side of things and really try to look at the best arguments going both ways.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, how did you get so passionate about this issue of immigration specifically?
Right. So I would say it first came on my radar when I was learning basic economics and the economics of free trade, and then there's a question, what about immigration? And then the economists I read said, well, immigration is free trade and labor. So if you think free trade is a good idea, you should think open immigration is a good idea. And I said, yeah, it makes great sense. And then I moved on and didn't worry about it much anymore. It's only when I started blogging that I did more, and I started reading more recent research on just how big the losses of different kinds of trade barriers are. And the main message of this research is that we have already greatly reduced regulation of trade in goods. And so actually the harm of the remaining regulation is very modest. On the other hand, the regulation of labor and international flows of labor remains extremely draconian. And then when economists measured how much is the harm of this, they came away with an astronomical number. Because basically, think about it this way. You let one more Haitian into the United States. It's very normal that his income multiplies by a factor of 10 or 20. Right? And economically, the reason this is happening is because that Haitian is producing 10 or 20 times as much stuff in the United States as he is in Haiti. And the whole point of the laws is to stop this. So when you think about all the people that want to come, and by most counts, that's hundreds of millions or billions of people want to come, times the typical gain per person of multiplying their contribution to the world by tenfold, say, you come up with an enormous number. And really what you come away with is immigration restrictions are by far the most harmful regulations on the planet in terms of how much they impoverish mankind and how much progress they are stopping.
Where does this sort of economic fear of immigrants come from? I mean, this always was sort of known. We're brought up even in school today, or maybe not today, but when I was a kid, we were still taught of how we were a nation of immigrants. We learned about Ellis Island, how we pretty much let everybody in and let them sort of build their own life. When did this nation sort of take a turn to the point where this sort of fear of whether it's economic or otherwise, that immigrants coming in from might actually be a bad thing, that we need to start looking at how can we restrict these numbers?
Yeah, so there was a lot of complaining about immigrants during the entire history of the United States. So you may have heard about anti-Irish movement and so on. Right. Of course, movement against Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants. But the crucial events were in 1921 and 1924. So 1921 imposed temporary quotas on immigration, and 1924 made them permanent and much lower, and also based them upon an earlier census. If you look at what people were saying at the time, it's quite clear. People were, I'd say, politicians were more honest in those days, or at least they were more honest about things that we would not be honest about today. So normally what proponents of immigration restrictions at the time said right on the congressional record is, this is a Nordic country, other peoples are inferior, and if we let them in, they're going to ruin our country. Right? So, around the, like people, like when I was taught the history of immigration, I was given the idea, well, the country was full by then, and so then they had to go and limit it. So basically immigration was good when the country was a frontier, but then bad afterwards. But that's really not an important part of what the actual arguments that changed people's minds. The actual arguments that changed people's minds were right now we're letting in a whole bunch of Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews and Italians and Greeks, and these people are terrible. So let's keep them out and we'll save our country. Right now, this does not mean that people are supporting the regulations out of racism today, although maybe. But it does mean that the reason they were put on the books was this very peculiar kind of racism that we barely even hear about today, which is this intra-white racism of the Nordic whites are far superior to the non-Nordic whites. Right now, of course, there are always just complaints about immigrants are causing unemployment, that kind of thing. But the reason went on the books was this idea of these are inferior peoples and we need to keep them out.
When you discuss open borders, what actually do you mean when you personally advocate for this? Are you talking about, because a lot of people will say open borders, well, you can't even have a nation if you have open borders. So are you talking about a situation where we would have no borders at all, or where we go back to sort of an Ellis Island model? How would you really define open borders in the sense of which you speak of it?
Yeah, so in general, when I write, all my books are controversial, and when I write a controversial book, I try to only sell people on the one controversial idea in the book. Mm-hmm. So I don't try to simultaneously convince everyone of all these the weird things that I believe, which I think I would just seem like a kook if I did that. So when I say open borders, it basically just means going back to the Ellis Island model, where anyone on Earth is free to live and work in any country where they want. So you could say it's the universal Ellis Island model, where it's not just the United States doing it, it's all countries. Although, of course, you'd expect that most of the immigrant flows are going to go from poor countries to rich countries. It's not just that. It's also going to be based upon proximity and language. But ultimately, the economic factor is the overwhelming one for most purposes. So it's just one where the border still exists. You still have all of the things you're used to, but the strong default is that anyone can come in. Of course, if they're a murderer on the run, then you find that and they go to jail. So it's, but of course you could say, in that sense, we don't have open borders, for people that are in the U.S. jails right now. So I would again just say that's just a separate issue. But sort of like the way that I picture it is, if movement is just as free for citizens as for non-citizens, that's what I think of as open borders.
What are some of the biggest myths out there that about immigrants that the common person who might be not even necessarily for closed borders or immigration restrictions, but someone who just expresses concerns about the issues of immigrations, what do you think are the biggest myths that are widely believed, I suppose, that are just completely untrue?
Right. So probably the biggest one is that it's not so much a myth as something that people are just oblivious to, and that is when a person moves from a place where they're paid very little to a place where they're paid very much, the production of mankind increases. Right? So normally people have a zero-sum view that when someone moves from Haiti to the U.S., they go and they take a job and there's no gain to the world. And I said, look, that's completely wrong. The American that is displaced will find another job someplace else will over the medium run with near certainty, and the Haitian then goes from contributing almost nothing to the world to contributing a lot. Right? I tell people this is just like women entering the U.S. workforce. This doesn't mean that American men can no longer find a job. It just means that women who previously would have not been able to go or would not have been selling their talents to the world are, and what they produce then is not only allows them to draw an income and have a better life, but it also is good for all their customers. So in terms of actual wrong things people think, probably the worst one is the idea that you don't want to let in low-skilled immigrants, that you want to let in people who are at least as good as the average of your country or better. So it's the idea high-skilled immigrants good, low-skilled immigrants bad. And again, I say this is just completely wrong, because key point, people with low skills are still useful people. Right? If the janitor at your business dies, it would not make sense to say, hooray, this person no longer burdens us. Well, wait a second. Like he did a job. He produced something useful. He
wouldn't be doing it and getting paid if we didn't need him to do it.
Yeah. So when someone says that a person making $30,000 a year is a useless person, that's what I say. That is crazy. That is a great thing to be.
And that person might be, their profession might be looked down upon here, or even their salary. But to the person who's trying to come here for an opportunity, that's a rich person's salary. I mean, if they can take their even minimal amount of skill and apply it to a job like being a janitor, that is a huge gain for them, and a huge gain to the economy, having someone working and filling a job that we do need done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, you'd say, wouldn't it be better to have Albert Einstein? And I say, sure, it's better to have Albert Einstein, but we don't have to only have Albert Einstein. We can have Albert Einstein plus 1,000 janitors. We can do both. And the idea that low-skilled people are worthless people or not, or like that somehow there's a problem with them, is completely wrong. So, in my book, I call this the arithmetic fallacy. And I have this example where imagine you've got a big, professional basketball team. They're all like average height of 6'10", or the average height 6'10", and then you let a bunch of toddlers onto the court. The average height on the court has just dramatically fallen, but this does not shrink the basketball players.
Right.
All that it means is that you have changed both the you've changed the denominator, you changed the group that you're sampling over, and so it can give you this illusion that there's a problem, but the point is no one has shrunk as a result of letting those toddlers onto the basketball court. And then if you've got fruitful cooperation, then great, right? And you can see this in places like the Gulf monarchies, where they let in tons of low-skilled workers who then go and produce useful low-skilled goods that people actually want and use and improve their standard of living. And of course, the immigrants themselves get a great deal in the process. So, and then, there's a bunch of other ones. There's the myth that immigrants are committing a lot of crime, at least in the U.S. They have lower crime rates than natives. There's the myth that immigrants are just champing at the bit to go and vote for socialism, right? And the actual evidence is immigrants barely want to vote at all, right? They're just not. They're very apolitical. Understandably, they show up in a new country, influencing the politics of the country is way down their list of priorities. Much more interested in getting a job. And
I always find that one to be the most ridiculous objection to me, because the idea that people are huddling, in a third world nation that are struggling to eat, just want opportunity, are sitting there plotting, if only we could go to the United States and vote for Democrats enough and increase that welfare state. Now that's how we're going to really succeed. I mean, it's really an absurd thing when you think about the reality of it.
Yeah, in the book I do say there is evidence that in the United States, foreigners are more socially conservative and more economically liberal than natives, which is what I think libertarians fear. The main thing, though, is when you measure it, it's a modest difference, right? And when you multiply that by the low probability that they vote anyway, and also just look at assimilation. Their kids generally assimilate to American norms, not the norms of their parents. So I guess another big myth is the idea that people that I guess it's, let me put it this way. So I've had a bunch of critics saying, Bryan's an idiot. He believes in magic dirt. He thinks that as soon as some Venezuelan socialist touches the ground of the U.S., this transforms him, and he goes from being an urban socialist criminal to being like a libertarian investment banker. I never said that. What I will say is two things. First of all, even first generation immigrants from very backwards and authoritarian nations, they assimilate enough to become productive members of society. And then secondly, their kids assimilate almost totally. Mm-hmm. Right. So I say, critics of immigration, they tend to look at the slightest sign of non-assimilation and then say, see, it's not happening. And what I say in the book is, if you want to get the real story of assimilation, ask an immigrant parent. See what they say. I've never met an immigrant parent who says, oh, my kids haven't Americanized at all. Like they're way more interested in India or Bangladesh than they are in the country they grew up in. Instead, it's always the opposite. They won't even speak my language. They aren't teaching my grandkids the language. They have no interest in anything about our culture. And I brought them here for this opportunity, but I feel alienated from my kids. Now I remember my editor was saying, well, we don't want to say that because there's some people who'll be upset about this happening. And I said, look, this is what happens. So I'm just going to be honest. So, some people's fears are unreasonable. The fear that people won't assimilate is unreasonable. On the other hand, if you're worried that they will assimilate, that's a real, like, and you don't like that, that's a reasonable fear. That's backed up by the facts.
Yeah, I actually remember when I was maybe 8 years old, one of my best friends who I used to play with all the time was Indian, which I didn't even think about until I went over to his house one day. I knew he had different color skin than me, but didn't think twice about that kind of thing when I was 8 years old. And I remember going over to his house and seeing that's when I really noticed that his family was so different than mine. When I went over to his house and saw all these, sort of Indian artwork and just a completely different looking house than the one I lived in. But when he left that house, he came over to my house and we played Nintendo. We listened to the same music. He seemed, when he interacted with me outside of that house, to be just as quote unquote American in the cultural sense as I was. It's only, like you said, when you go to the parents, they haven't assimilated. They're the first generation. They're still practicing their culture. But even at that young age, you can tell that the child, he's becoming an American every single second in terms of the cultural sense of things. Hey there, Liberty Kitties. Time to take a quick time out to tell you about one of our long-time supporters. His name is Tyler Colford, and he goes by the pseudonym Crypto Man. That's his rapping name. That's right. He is a rapper as well. He does some awesome stuff, and he recently produced a track called Free Ross. And the Ross in question is, of course, Ross Ulbricht, the creator of the Silk Road Marketplace, who was sentenced to 2 life sentences for creating that marketplace. Yes, it was a black market, indeed, of all sorts of things, including drugs, consensual transactions, which libertarians are completely in favor of. There were no victims and there were no crimes as far as we're concerned. So please do check out the track Free Ross. It was just released on Friday, March 27th, the 35th birthday of Ross Ulbricht. And 100% of the proceeds will go to the Free Ross Foundation, which is helping to free Ross and bring more awareness to his situation. Do check out the links. I will put them all over at lionsofliberty.com/freeross for ease of use. You can also pre-order it on Google Play. Again, 100% of the proceeds of this track will be going to help free Ross.
Still wonder why there's an overpopulation in the prison system, persecuting crimes when there is no victim. Parents doing time, separating children, perpetuating crime to a future generation. And
another thing I want to talk about is I want to go back. You mentioned it briefly, but the crime issue. That is something you hear a lot about, that immigrants bring more crime, that poverty brings more crime. Why do these myths hold? And what are some of the, are there any numbers you can toss out there to us about crime and immigration that we can kind of dispel some of that myth with?
Yeah, so why do the myths hold? I think it's because there are some immigrants who commit crimes. And you find the most dramatic story. You find an immigrant who went and murdered a whole family of natives after moving next door. And even though you say, well, there's 330 million people in this country, it's just an endless list of horror stories, if that's the way that you view the world. Well, I mean, if that's the way you're doing it, then of course you're going to wind up thinking that immigrants are terrible, because you can find a few that have done terrible things. Once I actually was speaking at the biggest anti-immigration conference in the United States as a foil. And I wasn't there, but in the afternoon, there was going to be a panel of a bunch of people whose family members had been murdered by illegal immigrants. All right. And what do you say about that? It's like, well, I mean, logically, the answer is, well, you could just as well have a panel about people murdered by Jews or Albanians or people with detached earlobes. It wouldn't be a reasonable basis for persecuting the entire group. But I wouldn't want to be on that panel, because there's just no way to not sound like a jerk when you say, look, I understand what happened to you, but we shouldn't do anything about it other than punish guilty people. That's it. Right now, in terms of the data, so this is one where some of the data isn't good. So in the book, I tried to track down the highest quality U.S. data that I can find, and I think the overall result is that immigrants have about 2/3 of the crime rate of natives.
By that logic, by the logic of people that worry about crime, you'd want to bring in more immigrants as much as possible, maybe deport some of the Americans, since we seem to be committing more crimes.
Yeah. It's a fun debater's point. Right. It probably is true that in Europe, the reverse is true, and the explanation is pretty simple, which is that native-born Americans have very high crime rates. So immigrants are better than us. On the other hand, native-born Europeans have really low crime rates, and therefore immigrants are worse than them. Right? The main thing I tell Europeans is, look, you guys have such little crime. Someone could have 50% higher crime rate than you, and it's still not much crime. Right? I mean, I know it doesn't sound very good to someone who's been a victim, but you shouldn't go and rely upon the most traumatized people in your society for deciding how the world ought to work.
Another objection I hear a lot of is that immigrants add to the welfare state. That this seems to be, I mean, especially people will point out to certain states like here in California, where hospitals and emergency rooms are required to give, medical care, full medical care to anybody who comes in, regardless of immigration status.
Yeah, it's all U.S. states, federal regulation.
Is that okay? Yeah. I mean, that's one of the big things you'll hear, that they continue to burden whatever systems we might have in place that help people, whether it's welfare or whether it's getting medical services. So what's your response to that objection?
Right. So I'd say that you've really got to look at the numbers here. So if you had a welfare state where one immigrant out of 1 million was getting benefits, would that be a problem? Not much. How about 1 out of 100,000? Not much. 1 out of 10,000? No. 1 out of 1,000. So anyway, you've got to really actually crunch the numbers here. So what the highest quality researchers do is they try to measure what's called the net present, the net present value of an immigrant's fiscal impact. Basically, what this means is you're trying to get a proper financial measure of all the taxes the immigrant will ever pay, minus the cost of all the services they will ever use, and then also factor in their kids, because their kids go to school, even if they're citizens. But on the other hand, the kids eventually grow up and they pay taxes. So anyway, there's a still fairly recent, high-quality version of this done by the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. And the punchline of this is that, first of all, the average immigrant we let in now is a net fiscal positive. That means that when you do the math properly, they pay more. They ultimately pay a higher value of taxes than they spend it in the cost of services. And then furthermore, if you go and break it down by education level and age, even low-skilled immigrants are a good deal for U.S. taxpayers as long as they're young. So basically, we're talking about just low-skilled elderly immigrants being a burden on U.S. taxpayers, and that looks like it does check out. Now, this is the kind of thing where it's so quantitative, it's very hard to believe someone telling you what the research says unless you already trust them, right? So, but so what I usually do here is say, look, all right, I mean, you're not, if you don't really trust me, you're not going to believe what I'm saying. But let me just tell you a few things that will make what I'm saying seem not crazy, right? So one of them is just to remember that a lot of government spending is what economists call non-rival. That means that the cost of the service does not depend on the number of people using it. So whatever your views on foreign policy, if we had a big baby boom, it wouldn't make sense to say we need more nuclear weapons. Right? Whatever your views on foreign policy are, we could defend 10 million new babies just as well as what we've got. And the same goes for not all, but many government services where the cost really has little or nothing to do with population. And so for those, letting in immigrants is a clear gain. It's like letting in someone for a discounted price when you're running a movie theater. Look, the theater was almost empty anyway, so even if you only get $2 off of the extra person, it's $2 free, right? And the other thing to remember is that most of the welfare states focused on the old rather than the poor, and most immigrants are young. Are young, so that's another reason why the actual fiscal burden is much more favorable to natives than it seems. Again, it's tempting to say, well, eventually the immigrants will be old, and then they will go and be a big burden on us. But a fundamental principle of finance is a debt delayed is a cheaper debt. You really can save money by kicking the can down the road, as long as the can does not grow in size. Right. And then finally, from the point of view of natives, another reason that immigrants are a good deal is that for a family of 3 natives, the public school system typically educates both the parents and the kid. For a family of immigrants, the public school system educates the kid, but not the parent. And therefore, you are getting a much better deal. You're basically instantly fast forwarding to 2 taxpayers. Whereas for native born, then taxpayers are on the hook for all of it.
Yeah, you're getting an instant discount by not having to pay for the adult school, I guess, coming in. One thing I want to address that you'll often hear in this discussion, look, we don't have a problem with immigrants. We just want people to do it legally. And I don't think it's really hard to drive home to people how difficult it is to immigrate to the United States, no matter what country you're from. I mean, I recently interviewed a guy named Michael Cheney. He's a millionaire businessman, entrepreneur in the UK. He gave up on trying to immigrate to the U.S. I mean, so even for someone with a high economic status that runs their own business, should be the quote unquote type of person you'd want to attract if you have that sort of view of things even. It was just too difficult for him to come over. So maybe you could break down just some of why it is so difficult to actually become a legal immigrant to the point that the concept is almost meaningless.
So I would begin by just asking people, how many people do you think would come to the U.S. if anyone could do it if everyone could do it legally? If all you needed to do was to present a passport at the border and walk in, right? And when you put it this way, almost everyone says, yeah, it'd be a crazy number. So you say, all right, well, what are immigration laws doing? They're keeping out all those people, right? Or another thing I like to say is, ask them, do you know how much you have to pay a smuggler to get in from different countries? Do you know how poor the people in these countries are? Why would you go and pay $75,000 to be smuggled from Pakistan to the U.S. unless there were very strict regulation making it very hard to come in? So, this is one where, like when I've debated Marc, who's head of the Center for Immigration Studies, probably the most influential anti-immigration think tank in the world, and he loves to say, we've had open borders policies for 30 years. And yet several times in public I've said, Marc, you don't really think we have open borders policies already. You know how many more would come if people listen to me. And I've actually gone in public and say, yeah, of course. Obviously, we've had nothing like open borders.
Right.
And then the next time I talk to him, he's back to saying the wrong thing again. But still, for that shining moment, he is accurate because he's a smart guy and he realizes that what he's been saying is crazy. It's just not true that we have anything remotely like open borders.
I mean, for many people around the world, it's hard to come here even to visit, even just to legally be a tourist. I mean, that process is so difficult, let alone trying to actually come here and work or anything like that.
The whole principle of getting a U.S. tourist visa is prove to us that you won't want to stay. Mm-hmm. Right? We assume you want to stay unless you prove to us that you don't want to stay.
Yeah, you sort of have to prove
this whole mentality of that would be the worst thing in the world if a person stayed. No, nobody wants that. Yeah,
to become a tourist, even you have to sort of prove in advance that you're not going to commit the future quote unquote crime of staying in this place that we might let you come visit if we decide you're worthy.
Yep.
One more thing I want to kind of look into a little bit with you. Obviously, it's hard to avoid what's going on around the world right now with coronavirus. And a lot of the responses of governments that you're seeing are to close things down. I know like the U.S. and Canada have closed borders to an extent. They're obviously allowing certain trade. Same thing with the U.S. and Mexico. That border has been closed. Again, they're allowing essential services and whatever they deem that to be. I'm curious if you could just speak on this topic of diseases and pandemics as a reason for closing borders. Do you see any sort of economic deleterious effects of closing borders in response to a virus? I mean, is it even is it even a solution that could even, I don't know if that's even something that could really stop a virus, quote unquote closing a border, but what are some of the economic ramifications of even just closing the border to whatever they deem to be non-essential travel, even if that's just basic tourism, visiting family and friends and that sort of thing?
Right.
That's a big topic, more than just more than a direct question, but I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
So first thing to notice is, once you realize how closed our borders already are, which I think it'd be fair to say they're 98% closed as they are, and you still see the virus had no trouble spreading to almost every country on Earth.
Right.
This is where you realize that to go and say open borders would lead to the spread of viruses. Well, wait a second. Like if when 98% closed led it to spread almost everywhere on Earth, then open borders, what further difference would it make? So the case where you can say, if you had 100% closed borders, which by the way would require not only that you don't let anyone from the outside in, it would require that you don't let anyone from your country ever leave and return. So it's not just a matter of keeping foreigners out. You have to keep your insiders in, or at least say you can leave once and then you can never come back. So that is the level of draconian regulation of borders that would genuinely be required in order to actually make a difference. So we've already seen you can have very strictly regulated borders and still viruses have very little trouble actually coming. Now, to be clear, in the book, in the very first chapter, I say, look, I'm not an absolutist. I'm not a Rothbardian saying I don't care if the world collapses as long as we hew strictly libertarian principles. What I do say is that libertarian principles are a default, and the burden of proof should be on those who want to bend those principles to say that there's going to be some enormous gain from this. And again, that's where I say, I don't see any sign of that. And now I could understand the argument if you were to say that, like back in like January, say, look, there's this terrible virus that's going to come out from China, and we're going to shut the border down completely right now with China, and that will then go and save us, right? So, if that were really, really true, then I think that would have been a reasonable thing to do. Again, of course, when you think about it more, it's like, well, you can't just do it with China. You have to do it against anyone who's come from China or gone to China.
Sure.
And so
now we're talking about almost everywhere because there's a lot of people in China and a lot of them leave the country. So
right. And then here's the thing, like the U.S. had closed down the border to the whole world then. Even so, then there's a question, right? So what about when are you ever going to reopen? Mm-hmm. Right. And I say the cost of never reopening is astronomical. So I would say that while in principle I am not opposed to bending libertarian principles in extreme situations, but I don't see that this is helpful. And then finally, of course, right now, the point of closing the border between the U.S. and Canada, I cannot imagine what that's really supposed to be. Look, the virus is already rampant in both countries, so you're not spreading contagion anymore, right? So like the most you could be doing would be like the same thing you'd accomplish by closing state borders inside of the U.S., where maybe you slow it down ever so slightly. But again, I would say that's the point when you are bending the principle for the flimsiest of reasons. And one thing I do not cotton to is bending principles for flimsy reasons.
Right. Yeah, and when you mentioned the state borders there, it seems to apply to any time people argue for border restrictions of a nation. I mean, why aren't we making those same exact arguments for borders between states, between maybe some states have more crime or less crime, maybe some states have different cultures? Are we worried about the culture of Alabama seeping its way into Northern California? I mean, these are things that work themselves out on their own. And when you look at it from the state borders point of view, it quickly breaks down the national borders point of view, because to me, there's no real difference. If we're talking about magic dirt, I mean, what's the difference?
Indeed.
All right, Bryan. Well, I do really appreciate you coming on the show today and breaking down this issue a bit for us. It's one of those things that I'm not sure if libertarians are ever going to agree on. Probably not, but the best we can do is put the arguments out there. So before I let you go, please just take a second to break down where people can find this book and how they can find more about their work, how they or more of your work, and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah, by the way, what's frustrating is I can actually remember a time when almost all libertarians were in favor of open borders. So like in the 80s, early 90s, libertarians who were opposed to immigration were very few and far between.
I always took it as the logical, the logical point of the philosophy, but only in recent years have I seen more and more people that seem to disagree. So I think it is something we need to keep pressing on, I guess.
Right. It's one where I say, look, if you are going to support national government saying that other human beings cannot live and work in your country without government permission, right? And this is not just like some minor thing about compromising on raw milk or something like that. This is a very fundamental principle that has, and it's one where the harm that you are doing to the people that are affected by the regulation is enormous, right? So it's not just a trivial thing. It is an enormous harm with horrible costs, and really, what I say in my book is for the flimsiest reasons again. So I'm not an absolutist saying it should never be done, but I am someone saying it should be done only after very serious thought and investigation. And I say when you do that serious thought and investigation, you come away with a very pro-immigration view. Much more favorable to banning Satanism than banning immigration. That's like what the great social gains of Satanism are. Less clear. But anyway, so so these days especially, I just say just get the book online. Amazon has a great price, $13.39, and this is a book, by the way, that while I wrote it for adults, but I also wrote it so that precocious kids would like it too, and I know a lot of kids have read it, and I'm really happy about that because I broadened my audience. All of my other books, this is the only book where my 5-year-old was ever looking over my shoulder reading it while I was writing it. So I felt like I knew I had actually cracked into a new audience when that happened.
Yeah, I think that's something great about the graphic novel format. It kind of makes it more accessible in so many ways. And first of all, it just makes it less intimidating than, say, some 500-page just words only tome might be to some people, where they see a graphic novel and it doesn't make it dumbed down. It just makes it easier to get through. You see pictures, you're telling stories. It's a different type of storytelling format. And it's the kind of book that I could see myself handing. I have an 8-year-old nephew. I could see him reading that and not having a problem really understanding the basic concepts. Like you said, it's not dumbed down, but it's definitely readable for people at a younger age.
Yeah, like I said, so I think you get a lot more information per minute of reading because a picture really is worth 1,000 words if you choose the picture well, and it's a lot more entertaining than a regular book. It's definitely my funnest book I've ever written, and I always try to make things fun. But this book, I'm willing to say, look, it's not just fun for a book; it's fun. So hope people check it out.
Right. And again, the book is Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. We'll also post a link to it over in today's show notes. Professor Bryan Caplan, thank you so much for joining me today on Lions of Liberty. Appreciate all the work you're doing out there. Keep up the great work. Keep on roaring.
Well, my pleasure. And just let me mention one other thing. So we actually never mentioned the name of my co-author, the illustrator.
Yes, that's very important. We should.
So he's a really famous guy. He is the one who draws the daily webcomic Saturday Morning Breakfast serial. If you don't know the name, you still quite possibly know the style of art. So if you look at the book cover and you say, "Hey, isn't that drawn by that guy?" And the answer is yes, it's drawn by that guy.
I did find myself thinking that I couldn't pinpoint it, but it seemed like a very familiar artistic style.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, great talking to you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Bryan. Appreciate it. Take care.
Okay, awesome.
All right, Liberty Kitty Cats. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Professor Bryan Caplan and our discussion about open borders. It's certainly a topic that not all libertarians agree on. Myself and Brian McWilliams actually had a little debate on that very topic that we did a live stream on for the Lions of Liberty Pride a couple months ago. Don't forget, you can join the Pride by heading over to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Get access to all sorts of exclusive bonus audio content like Conspiracy Corner, like Degenerate Gamblers. You get a first look at all the live streams that I've been doing over these lockdowns here. So be sure to check that out. And again, anybody who joins at $15 or higher per month will receive a free Tigers of Liberty t-shirt. That's in addition to the free Taxation is Death mug. So even if you stick around for 1 month, you've already made money on just those 2 products alone, let alone the fact that you get to support your favorite libertarian podcast, let alone the fact that you also get to support DonorSee and their efforts to help people being affected by coronavirus and by all the lockdowns and supply chain issues around the world. So there's just unlimited reasons to join the Lions of Liberty Pride. Be sure to check all of that out over on Patreon at patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And don't forget, my friends, it's not just me here on the flagship show every single Monday, bringing you compelling and interesting discussions like the one you heard today. We've also got Brian McWilliams slapping you in the face with his weekly shot of comedy, culture, and liberty. Again, if you missed his interview with Josh Dial, Joe Exotic's Libertarian campaign manager, you got to check that thing out. Just click back a few weeks in that podcast feed for his interview on Electric Liberty Land, Brian's weekly shot of comedy, culture, and liberty, while John Odie Odermatt wraps things up with his incredible, hard-hitting, and inspiring look at the broken criminal justice system every single Friday on Felony Friday. You really got to check out his interview from the other week where he had an inmate on from a federal prison describing all the terrible conditions there and all the ways that that prison is really setting up for a major outbreak of coronavirus. Should that virus get in there, I mean, the conditions there are just awful, and this is very common in America's prisons. Most people do not know about it, but it's very rare you get to hear from someone inside the prison at the time, and we can't even really tell you how John got that interview lined up, but you gotta check it out. So click back in that feed. There's so much great content here 3 days a week. Sometimes we give you a little more over here in the Lions of Liberty podcast feed. And of course, for even more content, if you just can't get enough, head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Even if you don't sign up for Patreon, you got to check out this Tigers of Liberty t-shirt. Please do head over to lionsofliberty.store to check that thing out, because you just got to see it to believe it. That's all I got to say, my friends. And until next time, I've got one last word to leave you with, and that is to encourage you all to please live long and live free.